All right, welcome to this presentation. So I don't know how many of you attended the previous presentation, MOD20, which was the first presentation of this learning path. If you haven't, don't worry about it. It's all good. This session stands on its own as well, so you can see it without any prior conception or whatever. But however, in case you're interested to follow the whole learning path, so this is a learning path about modernizing your application, which is basically about bringing your application from on-premise to the cloud and then augmenting this application. So here, in this particular session, we are going to concentrate on the data, the database. And I have to tell you, it's a great time to migrate to Azure. First of all, we have more services than ever before. We have more opportunities for you to host your data in the cloud. We have a lot of ways to use this data, for example, with AI or with serverless applications or with all kinds of reporting and all kinds of things like that, business intelligence, etc. But we also have more tools than ever to migrate the data to Azure. And of course, there is a number of reasons why people want to migrate to Azure. Maybe the data center contracts comes to an end, it's time to relocate, and then maybe it's time to rethink your hosting strategy. Maybe you have acquired a firm or you have been acquired by a firm, and then you have a hybrid data architecture, data landscape that you need to integrate together. And on Azure, you can do that fairly easily because we have a lot of different ways to store your data, but we also have some ways to communicate between those services. So we have a lot of possibilities to build hybrid architectures. Maybe you need capacity. And on Azure, it's really cool because you can scale up very fast. You can get more bandwidth, more capacity for your data. You can get more RAM for the compute. But also, if the demand disappears, we can also scale down. And like this, you pay only for what you actually use. Software, hardware, refresh on Azure, we always keep you to the latest. If something's break, we will replace it. You won't even notice it. We will patch you with, for example, security patches, etc. Compliance is also one reason that might bring you to the cloud. Application innovation, like I mentioned, we have so many services that you can use to build applications around your data. And finally, software end of support. I want to remind you that Windows Server 2008 as well as SQL Server 2008 are coming soon in end of support, and so it might be a good time to rethink your data strategy, maybe upgrade that, and maybe take this opportunity to move to the cloud. So we have a lot of capabilities across applications, data, and infrastructure. Azure Migrate is where you get started with everything migration. We'll talk more about that a little bit later, not just for data, but also for virtual machines, for websites, etc., etc. Azure Site Recovery is still there. You can back up and restore. It's a trusted way to do things. But if you want to have things a little bit more managed and with more flexibility, the Azure Database Migration Service is a great place to go, and we'll talk a lot more about that, and we'll also have a demo later of the DMS. You can use this data, for example, with app services. We have Linux support, we have serverless with Azure Functions. Those are just some examples of the many, many ways that you can build application with this data. And finally, in terms of hosting, I don't know if you know that, but you also have the possibility to host open source databases, for example, PostgreSQL, MySQL, MariaDB on Azure, and have all the advantages of the cloud, but using those well-known data solutions. We also have Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. It's a new flavor of Azure SQL, and later we'll talk more about that, as well as NoSQL solutions with Cassandra, MongoDB on Azure Cosmos DB, and here too we'll see some demos. So the Azure Database Migration Service is a very interesting service. It is a managed way to bring your data to the cloud. As you can see, you have a number of sources possible, including AWS, which I misspelled AWQ. I just saw that now. I need to fix it. As well as Oracle. And you can migrate those in different places. For example, VM, of course, infrastructure as a service, but also platform as a service with Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Database managed instance. And we also have MySQL, PostgreSQL, as well as Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB. So this database migration service, we'll use it more later in this presentation. But before we go there, I also want to mention that you have ways to migrate your data in an offline manner. And to do that, what you can do is go to the portal and order an Azure data box. You have different possibilities to do so depending on the capacity that you need. We will deliver those data boxes to you. You can put the data on it on your premises, and this data will be encrypted in the box, and then you ship that back to our data centers, and our engineers are going to put the data on Azure. So it's a nice solution if you don't have basically, if your internet is not great and you have high volumes of data, so if it's very slow, or if you just want to migrate in an offline way because you don't trust the internet for one reason or another. Databox Edge also allows you to run some Azure services on your premise directly. And Databox Gateway is a pure online solution which creates a link between Azure and your premises. So different solutions to do data. Okay, so Tailwind traders, well, breaking news, we already talked about that earlier in the tour, so I'm sure you might have heard the news already, but Tailwind traders acquiring Northwind, that's a big deal, right? Northwind, this venerable institution, everybody pretty much used their their assortment of goods, and of course used also their data solutions. And this is really an old school firm, right? They were running their data center. I used to joke about it and say they were running it under the CEO's desk on an old PC. It's not quite the truth, but it's kind of that. And of course, Tailwind traders is almost the opposite, right? They run something which is international, which is global. They want to have reliability, security. They want to be in the cloud. They have a rich catalog, a nice web application that we are going to see in a moment. And this application is architected like that. So before the move, before what we need to do now, which is basically migrating the data to the cloud, we have something which is hybrid, and my colleague Jay in the earlier presentation already migrated the application, the web application, to Azure. So this is a front-end ASP.NET application with the front-end of React.js. And on-premise, it is going to get the data from some virtual machine. So we have a virtual machine running Linux, which is running MongoDB, and this is going to be for our shopping cart. And then we have another virtual machine. This one is running Windows Server 2012. It is running SQL Server 2012 as well. And this is our inventory, our product descriptions and everything. So this is what we have before the migration. And after the migration, what we will do is put everything on Azure. And we are going to start by the SQL database, which we are going to put into an Azure SQL database on Azure. And for the MongoDB, we will use Cosmos DB, our NoSQL offering, but we will use a Mongo API so that we don't need to change anything in the application, and so that will be quite convenient. Okay, so let's start talking about NoSQL. So NoSQL is nice. It's a nice way to have data which is a little bit less structured than SQL, okay? The data in SQL has tables, it has relationships between the tables, it's quite, it has a schema and everything. In NoSQL with Cosmos DB, we don't need all that, and this is very a flexible way to store data. So Azure Cosmos DB is a global service, and you'll tell me, well, SQL is also a global service. I can replicate my data in multiple locations, and that's true. But maybe the difference with Cosmos DB is that it was thought from the start as a global service. And really, it is architected from scratch as a global service. It is running everywhere. You can have multiple read, but also write locations. And of course, there are two reasons why you want to do that. First of all, for reliability, because Let's say that you have a location in Western Europe and something happens. Maybe there is a big thunderstorm and the electricity goes down. The whole data center is gone. And of course, you lose access to your data temporarily. But if you have another location somewhere else, we are going to switch and fail over to this other location automatically, and your users are barely going to notice anything. The other reason is, of course, latency. We reduce latency by putting the data closer to the users, and like this, you have faster access for read, but also for write. So another feature of Cosmos DB is that it's a multi-modal database. You can store data, for example, with key value, column family, document, graph, and you have different APIs on top of that. So if your application is running MongoDB or Cassandra or Gremlin, you can basically migrate this data to the cloud using the appropriate API, and you don't need to change your application. You just need to switch the connection string, and that's it. So let's do a demo of that. And for this demo, I'm going to migrate our shopping cart from MongoDB to Cosmos DB. So first of all, let me show you our application. So this is the Tailwind Trader application. As you see, it's a website. You will notice that there is a debug header on top, which is saying where the data is coming from. And the SQL Server, it's an IP address. It's our on-premise virtual machine that I mentioned before, running Windows Server 2012. Here I have a Mongo server, which is a Linux virtual machine. And on this machine, I have Mongo installed. And so let's take a look at the website. So here I have a list of items, as you can see. And if I log in using an email address and a password, I can log in, and then I can basically start adding some items to the cart. So for example, wooden commode. You never have too many wooden commodes, right? So I'm going to increase the number because I have a big house. So I'm going to put here 3 wooden commodes. And then if I go back and maybe I want to go to plumbing, and let's take a kitchen stove. I'm going to add this to the cart. And here we go. So now I have a cart. I have some items in my cart. So that's all good. And for the destination of the data, this is a Cosmos DB that we are going to use. It is running Mongo API. And as you can see, I don't have any collection at the moment. So this is my destination for the data. So let's start to do the migration. I'm going to go into my database migration service, which has been created earlier. And as you see, I don't have any migration project at the moment. I'm going to create a new one. And by the way, if you wanted, you could also use the native Mongo tools to do that. Mongo dump, Mongo restore. For small data sets, it's okay. But for bigger data sets, we don't recommend using that. The database migration service is playing very well with Cosmos, especially with the throughput. So you can have you can throttle the data and you can control a lot more. So if you have bigger data sets, we recommend using the DMS over Mongo dump, Mongo restore. But for small data sets, the native tools can work as well. Okay, so let's enter a project name, MigMongo, and here you see the source that I can choose from. And as I told you, you have a number of sources, right? Those are the sources we saw on the slide before. So if I select MongoDB, I have one possibility to migrate to, which is Cosmos. And here we have the type of migration. So we have the choice here between offline and online. And right now I'm going to choose offline. But later we'll understand what is online data migration and why we can choose it. So right now I'm choosing offline data migration. I'm going to create and run my activity. All right. And now, of course, I need to specify the source and the target for the data. So for the source, I'm going to copy the connection string of my Mongo VM. I'm going to use here the connection string mode. It's a little bit more convenient. And this is a connection string of my Linux virtual machine on which MongoDB is running. Let's save that. And then after that, for the target, it's going to propose to me some choices based on what I have in my Azure subscription. And here, as you can see, it's selected Ignite the Tour. This is good. I'm going to choose MOD20 here, which is the Cosmos database that I want to save the data to. All right, and then after that, basically here it is trying to log into the source and the target. It's going to ask me what do I want to do for with my data. So what kind of database do I want, collection do I want, etc. And so here you see that it says, okay, we have a source database, a target database. I could throttle the throughput if I wanted to. Here I don't need to do that because it's a relatively small data set. And here for the collection, it's going to tell me, all right, we are going to create a new card collection, which is correct. And now I'm doing the migration. Okay, so it's going to just take a few seconds because it's relatively small. I'm going to say here the activity is called MIG-Mongo. Let's run that. And then once this is done, I'm going to be able to switch the connection string in my web application. The migration is complete, so I'm going to go here into my MongoDB, my Cosmos DB application running MongoDB. I'm going to go to connection strings. And here, this is a location where I can find the primary connection string. I'm going to copy that, go into my application service, into my website, which is running on Azure, into configuration. And here I'm going to switch the connection string. And since the application needs to restart and it's going to take just a couple of minutes, then we'll take a quick tour of the Cosmos DB instance that I'm using here. All right, so let's go down to the Mongo connection string. Notice that right now it has the old connection string, which is the the virtual machine. I'm going to copy that, to paste that, and now it is running a Cosmos DB. But notice that I'm still using MongoDB protocol because I am using the Mongo API. So let's click OK and save. And now while the application is restarting, the web application is restarting, I can give you a quick tour of the Cosmos DB database that we have. So first of all, the connection string, right? This is where you get everything you need, the username, the password, the connection string, etc. I want to show you the replicate data globally tab. This is an interesting tab because I told you this database is designed to run globally. And right now I only have one location in Western Europe. That makes me a little bit nervous because if anything should happen, I'm kind of losing my data access, my shopping cart. And of course, shopping cart is a very important part of my web application, right? So I'm going to put this data in Western US and Eastern US as well. And I do have some customers in different regions of the world as well. So I have customers in Australia, and I have some in Singapore, which the Southeast Asian market is booming these days. And I'm also going to put a copy of the data in Japan. And so right now I configured that. I'm going to enable multi-region writes as well. Like this, I have low latency, not just for reading the data, but also for writing, because when people put things in the shopping cart, you want this to happen very fast. And now if I click save, it's going to start the replication process, and my data is going to be copied. Here, just for the demo, for the recording, I'm going to discard, but when I do the actual presentation, I'm going to save. All right, the other thing I want to show you is the metrics. So this Cosmos DB has a lot of service level agreements, some SLAs, and we guarantee some values. And if we exceed those values, we will give you some money back. So for example, latency is one of the values that we guarantee. Here, as you can see, we guarantee a read below 10 milliseconds, and we also guarantee a write below 10 milliseconds. And if we cannot hold that, if we exceed those values, if we are slower than that, you can, place a support request and we'll give you some money back. Availability is another one of those values that we guarantee. Notice that we are at 100%. We guarantee 99.999%, so 5 niners. And right now we are at 100%. Everything's good. And one day maybe we'll go to 100.0002%. That would be really cool. It has never happened so far, but crossing fingers. All right, so now I guess my application has restarted. So I'm going to refresh my shopping cart. Notice that now the source of the application, the source of the shopping cart is the new Cosmos DB, but my data has been migrated properly. I have my 3 wooden commodes, I have my kitchen stove. And in fact, we can do something really fun. Let's go here into the Data Explorer. This is where I can actually visualize my data. All right, so this is going to just give me access here directly in the web portal. Another way would be to use the Azure Storage Explorer, which is an application that you install. It's a cross-platform application. But here directly in the web portal, I can actually see my items. And I'm going to add a new document. from scratch, and I'm going to just fake something. So I'm going to copy here some JSON here, and let's paste that. And so this is a new product that I'm adding. I'm going to save that. And as soon as I save this and I go back to my website, notice that I have a new item, and this is our Bit, our mascot, Bit, the raccoon. It costs only $999. It's a great value. I think you agree. And so I decided to order 3. And so as you can see, I can now basically interact with my data directly in the Azure portal, and everything is working fine. The shopping cart has been updated. That's great. So there is one flow to this migration process, which is that you probably noticed that, I told you, okay, I'm going to start the migration, and then I talked a bit, and then we did the actual migration, and then I talked a little bit more, and then only I switched the connection string. And of course, during that time, if my customers were actually buying things, this would be lost, right? Because they were buying things in the old database while I was migrating to the new one. And so there is a disconnect here. So that's not how you do a migration normally. Normally, when you migrate, you need to say, all right, I'm going to switch off the website for a moment. And then you do a fancy page saying, oh, we'll be back soon. And during that time, what do your customers do? Basically, they go to the competition and they buy from the competition. And they probably never come back to your site. So that's not really great. And this is why the DMS, if you remember, we had this choice between offline and online migration. And online migration is a way to start a data migration without shutting down your website. You don't need to have downtime, because what's going to happen is that the DMS is going to keep the source and the target database synchronized as long as it's running. So you can do your migration. When the migration is finished, you can say, all right, now I'm going to run maybe a staging environment of my website on the data. If something happens on the old database, those changes keep being synchronized, all right? And once you have verified that everything is running fine, you can say, all right, now I'm going to switch my connection string. All the changes have been synchronized during that time, and then only you can switch off the database migration service because you don't need it anymore. So the online migration is a great scenario, especially if you have some data which changes a lot and data where the changes are vital. For example, our shopping cart here. All right, so let's go back to the slides, and let's talk now about SQL. But before we go into SQL, I want to mention that you have the possibility to learn about Cosmos DB in our Microsoft.com/learn. And this is a cool way to learn. You get some experience points as you go through those modules. Here we have a module which takes about 6 hours to complete. And that's really going to teach you a lot of things. We have tons of learning paths directly in your web browser here, and you can also try things. We give you some sandbox where you can try things, even if you don't have an account. So it's really cool. All right, so let's talk about SQL now and relational data. And so when you do a migration, there are different steps that you want to take. The first step would be probably to assess your migration and to make sure that the migration is actually going to work. And the reason why you want to do that is that maybe on-premise you are using some features which are not necessarily available in Azure SQL database, such as cross-database joins or maybe some compiled CLR, or there are a few features which are pretty advanced. And if you use some very old versions of SQL Server, maybe you are not sure if those features will be available in Azure SQL database. So an assessment is a great place to start. And then we'll see that if you are using some features which are not compatible with Azure SQL database, you can upgrade to Azure SQL database managed instance, and then you have almost 100% compatibility, and then you don't have a problem at all. So let's start with the assessment phase. And for this, I'm going to show you a small video, and this video is showing how to use a data migration assistant. It's an application that you can install, which allows you to do some assessments. So let's see the video. So here I'm going to start the DMA. And inside this, we are going to create a new project. And I'm going to do an assessment. I'm not going to do migration. You can actually use a DMA to do migration as well, but only of smallish data sets. I would say for big data sets, we really recommend using the DMS instead. So notice that you can access a migration directly from AWS and Oracle as well. Here I'm going to enter the server name, which is my this is a source server. This is my virtual machine with username and password. And the DMA is going to log into that. For the target, I specified that I'm trying to migrate to an Azure SQL database. I'm going to select which database I want to access. Let's start the assessment. Here it's a small database, so it's not going to take very long. And the DMA is going to show that we have just one feature which is not supported, is a SQL Server reporting services. It's okay because I'm not actually using that, but it's good to know. And so at this point, I could say, all right, if I need this feature absolutely, I could decide to upgrade my target from Azure SQL Database to Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, and then I wouldn't have a worry because Managed Instance is almost 100% compatible, even with old versions of SQL Server. So now I see that I don't have compatibility issues. I just have one small feature parity issue, so I'm ready to do the migration. All right, so Azure SQL Database, there is a huge momentum, right? We have 5.8 million databases, if you can imagine that, 70 petabytes in size. The database migration service has already been used 37,000 times to migrate databases to Azure SQL Database. So it's a big deal, right? We have a lot of partners who are using that. And SQL Managed Instance, oh, I forgot something. Okay, that's fine. I'll just finish this. And SQL Managed Instance, like I mentioned, if you have some worries about your compatibility, this is something you can use. It is generally available. It is ready for the enterprise. It's really an enterprise-grade solution, I would say. And it makes it easy to migrate SQL Server to the cloud because of this huge compatibility that you have. So you have all the benefits of a fully managed service. It's a platform as a service offering as well. And if I go back to this migration diagram, basically we did the assessment. In the migration phase, this is where you're going to rehost your data. You're going to lift and shift if you wish. But then after that, you have a small refactoring, at least switching the connection string, maybe changing a few things in your application. But one thing you want to avoid is re-architecting and rebuilding your application. And with SQL Managed Instance, that allows you to really concentrate on the rehosting and refactoring, light refactoring, but you don't need to re-architect or rebuild your application because of this increased compatibility. Also, because it's a platform as a service, it's not a virtual machine. It's platform as a service, so it's going to allow you to optimize, for example, do some cost optimization or performance optimization, security, etc., etc. So what is SQL Database Managed Instance? It's a new flavor of Azure SQL Database if you want, all right? So single database, we know that. Elastic Pool, if you need to scale up, scale down. Managed Instance has a third flavor, and it is really built on the same infrastructure as SQL Database, so you have the same benefits. You can use the tools like SQL Server Management Studio, etc., etc. But in addition, you have this increased compatibility, almost 100% compatibility with the on-premise SQL Server, and full isolation and security. So it is running inside the virtual network. You get only private IP addresses, no public IP. So if you are afraid that somebody else from the outside could gain access to your data, with Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, you are very, very well protected. You use ExpressRoute, VPN to connect. And it is more expensive than Azure SQL Database single database. We want to be clear about that, but we also are very transparent about that fact. You can go to the portal, you can change maybe your CPU or the number of cores that you want to use, or maybe change the capacity of the database, and we'll show you the new pricing in a very transparent manner, and it's also competitive. All right, so let's go back to our DMS and let's do this migration for our product database. So right now the products are running on this SQL Server, which is running on-premise. In fact, here I have opened a remote desktop connection to it. You see that I have my server manager running. All right, so this is the source of my data. And if I go back to my database migration service, Now I'm going to start a new migration project. And the first step, this is a two-step approach here because I'm using Azure SQL Database single instance. If I was using the managed instance, I don't need to migrate the schema at first. This is going to happen automatically. But here I need to migrate the schema at first, and then we'll migrate the data. So first of all, let's enter a new project. This is MIG-SQL. I'm going to take the source, which is going to be SQL Server, and the target is going to be Azure SQL Database. And so here, based on the assessment, I would have possibly to choose Azure SQL Database Managed Instance instead. But here, because the assessment told me it's fine, I can do Azure SQL Database. For the type of activity, we also have a choice between offline, online. And here for SQL, in addition, we have schema only. So right here, I'm going to do schema only, and then later we'll do the data migration itself. All right, the assessment, we have done it already, so we don't need to do it again. Let's create and run this activity. Here, again, I'm going to need to enter some information about the source and the target. So the source is going to be my virtual machine. So let's copy the IP address. I'm going to use SQL authentication, Tailwind, and then I'm going to copy here the password. All right, so this is the source of my data. And then after that, for the target, I'm going to copy that into an Azure SQL database. By the way, it is here. So this is a SQL database we are going to use. Right now, it's completely empty. There is nothing in it. All right, so for the target, I'm going to enter the address of the host. And it is also going to use SQL authentication with the same username and the same password. All right, so now the DMS is trying to log into the database, and then it's going to ask me to select which database I want to actually migrate. And as a reminder, here we're just migrating the schema only. We're not migrating the data yet. Okay, I'm going to select my target database. Let's save that. And for the activity, I'm going to call that MIG schema. And here I have the possibility to validate my database as well. Here, for the sake of time, I'm not going to do the validation, but of course, in production, you probably want to do that. All right, so the schema migration is running. All right, it's going to take a small moment to migrate. During that time, I can actually show you a little bit about this SQL DB. And one thing you might be interested in too is geo-replication, because you can do that with SQL DB as well, as I mentioned before. And here the geo-replication is thought more in terms of a backup. Okay, so you can manage replication, you can manage the failover, and say, all right, when should thing basically move to another region in case something happens. So this is a good place to start. Advanced data security is something which is really important and really a great value of platform as a service for your data. For example, here I switched on vulnerability assessment. And this is really cool because what it's going to do is that it's going to scan my data periodically. And there is an AI which is going to analyze all kinds of threats. And here I configured things like, scripting attack, for example, or I configured things like invalid login. So if people are logging in too often with invalid passwords, for example, I'm going to get notified. Here also we have some scan, so I can start the scan manually, or it's going to happen also automatically. And here it's telling me that I have three things that are failing the checks, and I might, they are high risk. I probably want to check those up and maybe fix them. For example, on the master database here, auditing should be enabled at the server level. I totally agree with that. Server level firewall rules should be tracked and maintained at a strict minimum. So basically what it's telling me is that my database right now is a little bit at risk, and it gives me some suggestions on how to change that. So really some cool stuff happening here in this platform as a service. All right, let's go to the migration. Let's refresh. Now it's completed. That's great. So I can go back to my DMS, and now I'm going to do the migration of the data. So let's go back to the same activity because I'm targeting the same server for the source as well as for the target. So I can use the same project. and I'm going to create a new activity. And here this time I can choose between online and offline. Now this is my product database, so it's probably not going to change. I own those databases, so I can do an offline database for the sake of time. But as I told you, if you are worried about changes during the migration, you can do an online migration instead. All right, so the address of the source didn't change. I just need to re-enter the password for security reasons. Again, for the target, same thing. It's not going to have changed. So I can, again, just enter the password and click on save. And then the next step is going to do a mapping of the database. All right. Here we go. So I'm going to select here the Tailwind SQL database and map that to my SQL DB here. And here, by the way, if I'm worried about changes, I can set the source database to read only. And like this is going to basically prevent changes in the source database to happen while I do the migration. So since I'm doing an offline migration here, maybe it's a good idea to do that. All right, here we see the tables, and we have 5 tables which are going to get migrated. This is great. I just need to enter a name for the activity, MIG data, and then again the validation option, which in that case I'm going to select no validation just for the sake of time, but I could also validate this if I wanted to. All right, so the validation, the migration of data is going to be pretty fast. Again, this is a fairly small database, but if you had some big data, you could use that as well. It's just going to take longer. The migration is pending. All right, things are starting up. And now it's completed already. That's great. So now I can actually go and take the connection string. And by the way, the connection string, you can always find it here in the portal, okay? And if I go to connection string, you see that I have, for example, ADO.NET, JDBC, ODBC, etc. I need the ADO.NET one. I actually filled here the username and password already, so I'm going to cheat a little bit and copy from my cheat sheet. Let's go here to the configuration of the web application. And here I'm going to replace my SQL connection string with a new one, press OK, and press save. Again, it's going to restart the web application, so it's just going to take a couple of minutes. But basically, you can believe me, if I come here and go back to Tailwind Traders and refresh in a couple of minutes, it's going to show me that it is using the data from the new database and not from the old one anymore. It's not quite done yet, but it's just going to take a little bit longer. All right, so let's go back to the slides. So first of all, again, just like before with NoSQL, we also have a learning path in microsoft.com/learn for the SQL relational data. So here you can find more information about that and get started with that. You don't need an account for that. I also want to mention our Azure database for open source DBs. And notably PostgreSQL, MySQL, MariaDB. Those are very, very popular options, and you can run them on Azure. So you have all the advantages of your open source databases, but also the advantages of the cloud. For example, the scaling up, scaling down. You have also automatic backups, built-in monitoring, security, etc., etc. We support also a number of languages and frameworks, .NET, of course, but also Java, JavaScript, etc. So it is really cool to build applications. Specifically about PostgreSQL, this is a very, very popular option that we have on Azure at the moment. It's a very popular database, open source database. We have actually some contributors who work at Microsoft, so it is really something that we like and that we observe. If you want to know more about PostgreSQL, we have documentations here, and this is where you can get started. We also, of course, have documentation for MariaDB and MySQL. All right, let's just go back because I'm curious to see if the application restarted properly. So I'm just going to go back to my application, refresh, and now you see that the SQL Server is using the new database, but basically my application is running just like before and I can interact with it. I didn't have any downtime during the migration and my users barely noticed what happened, but now I'm using with all the benefits of the cloud. Perfect. So I have some resources for you. So in terms of resources, first of all, did you know that you can get certified? And maybe it's a great time to think about, well, this cloud thing is really taking off like crazy. A lot of firms are migrating to it. I see, for example, in Switzerland, we are getting some data centers in Switzerland now. And so that makes me think, well, maybe it could be interesting to get a certification. And we have a specific certification for Azure Data Engineer Associate. And so this is a place where maybe your career is going to take a turn for the better, and then you can learn a lot of new things. So something really interesting to consider. A few other things which are interesting. Once you migrated your data, you probably want to think about security. Now, data on Azure is secure by default because it is encrypted at rest always. It is, you can configure a lot of security, but you can always be more secure. And this learning path here on Microsoft.com/learn is going to teach you how to secure your cloud data. You see that it's almost 7 hours of fantastic content. So a good place to go if you want to learn more about security. We have the Azure Cost Management Center. So once you have migrated, we are going to propose you some solutions to optimize your costs. All right. So you'll get some recommendations. For example, if you have a virtual machine that is idle, we recommend that you turn it off. Some things are no-brainers, but some things are more complicated. And by the way, if you have already some SQL Server licenses for your on-premise, we have something called the Azure Hybrid Benefit. So it's a button that you can click when you create your instance, and then you can say, yes, I have licenses already, and you can save a lot of money, up to 55% of the total cost of Azure SQL database. So definitely something you want to do. We call this our save money button. Our accountants hate it, so please click it, because we love to pass the savings to you. All right. If you want to get started and understand what benefits Azure is going to bring you in terms of cost, you can go here to this page. It's our total cost of ownership calculator, and it's going to allow you to enter some parameters about your installation, about your application, and then it's going to calculate the estimated cost, and we will give you a nice report on PDF. You can even put your logo on it. You can show that to your CFO and say, hey, look, I spent hours and hours creating that. Actually, it took you maybe half an hour, but he doesn't need to know that. And nicely branded, everything's great. And then like this, you can make a case for the migration to Azure from a financial standpoint. Finally, Azure Migrate. This is a great location to get started with everything migration. We give you a lot of guidance. We give you some tools, and also we recommend some partners, migration experts. If you want to get started but you are not quite sure how to do things, it's a great hub to get started, not just for database, but also for things like virtual machine, web applications, etc., etc. So definitely recommend that you check it out. All right, so this is where you can get resources. You'll get the slides at this address. You can also go to GitHub, and even though we didn't have code here, you will find on GitHub some nice scripts which allow you, for example, if you have a free Azure account, to get started with an environment so that you can try the migration yourself. The free Azure account gives you $200 of credit that you can use on anything. So for example, you can use it to try some migration for yourself. If you have an Azure account already, you can of course use that. And if you go to the GitHub, this is a good place to find a nice script of the demos that we just did. And that's going to help you to understand what we did here. Finally, if you liked this session, I want to recommend you MOD20, which is options for data in the cloud, which I'm going to also present it this time in this room and location. And MOD10, you might have missed it, or maybe you saw it already. It was a previous session in this learning path, migrating web applications to Azure. Later in the tour, we are going to record those sessions. So if you missed MOD10, you will be able to catch it on video. And finally, the next session in this learning path, MOD30, where we are going to show you after the migration is finished, what can you do to enhance your application, for example, with serverless or other applications. And we are going to show you a range of possibilities. At this point, I want to thank you so much for your attention. It was a great pleasure to show you this session today. If you have some questions, I recommend that you come to our Ask the Expert area in the hub, because I will be there a lot today and tomorrow. And this is a great place to meet me and to talk about everything which interests you, ASP.NET, .NET Core, Visual Studio, Xamarin, or of course, data migration. Thank you so much for your attention and have a great day.